Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Civitas Podcast. In today's episode, we have Professor Jeffrey Miron from Harvard University. He is one of the leading professors in not only economics but political science, and today he has joined us to share his insights and his research findings to our high schoolers. Hello, Professor, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So, thank you. Professor, let's start with your foundational work on prohibition. We know that your work on prohibition is really famous, and your research has long argued that prohibition creates far more harm than the substances itself through black markets and violence. So, however, today we face severe fentanyl-driven overdose crisis. Does the nature of synthetics like fentanyl change your assessment of what full legalization would like in practice, or does prohibition still remain in the primary cause of the harm? What do you think?
I would argue that prohibition is the primary cause of the harm from opioids such as fentanyl and heroin and others. And the reason is that when you buy these substances in an underground market, you don't have an easy way to determine the dosage that you're getting and the dosage that you're consuming. If these were available in a legal market, they would come with the dosage clearly labeled. Okay, they would come in tablets or injectable amounts or solutions where it was very easy to consume a modest dose. Okay, and so most people would do that to relieve pain or what other symptoms or to forestall withdrawal if they had become, physiologically addicted. But very few people would accidentally overdose, okay, because they would know what they were getting. It doesn't mean there would be no overdoses. There are overdoses from all sorts of things, okay, because people sometimes accidentally do something that's not sort of sensible. But the frequency should go down dramatically. They are mainly occurring now under prohibition because people don't know what they're getting and they can't easily on their own determine the dosage, the potency, and make sure that it's moderate enough that they don't get extreme side effects.
Powerful perspective. You've consistently applied a libertarian and limited government lens across a broad range of policy questions. Has there ever been a policy area where your own empirical analysis pushed you towards a more interventionist or regulatory conclusion than you initially expected?
I don't think so. I think that my experience has been originally coming to all of these policy questions not as libertarian, but as a standard modern, US sort of kind of liberal Democrat, is I was relatively open and sympathetic to interventions and to government making things better. But as I explored them more carefully and brought the critical lens that you described at the beginning, what are all the negative effects of the intervention and how do those compare to the potential negative effects of letting markets determine these outcomes? I gradually came to the view that very consistently the interventions do more harm than good. Now, even libertarians make a very small number of exceptions and have cases where they think governments should intervene. Enforcing laws against violence and theft is the obvious example. And the other obvious example is for supplying some level of national defense, okay, national security. But even in those cases, libertarians typically argue that there's way too much government criminal justice activity and way too much use of the military to try to accomplish various goals around the globe. So, again, my assessment of the evidence is it makes a case for less and usually dramatically less or zero government intervention.
Okay, so we know that you are like you teach in Harvard University. You are the director of undergraduate studies of economics, and I always had a question like, how do you balance teaching at these institutions, like teaching standard neoclassical welfare economics, which often assumes a benevolent social planner, against the kind of institutional and public choice skepticism that runs through your own research?
I think economists very broadly, regardless of their own political persuasions, are open to the view that both of those two perspectives you just described, okay, are useful and have significant elements of truth. It's certainly useful to say, what would a benevolent social planner do faced with some type of market imperfection, an externality, or a public good? But I think economists are sort of inherently trained to realize that any type of action by an individual, by a government, by a firm, affects the incentives of the other people they interact with. And some of those effects might be unwanted effects, might be unintended negative consequences. So it's a judgment call and it's an empirical call to sort of figure out, when do the interventions tend to do good on average and when do they tend to do more harm than good on average. And I have my own particular view, and I think my view is more negative because the textbook analyses of the pros and cons of particular policies, I think take a simplified case, as you have to do to try to get across an idea initially, okay, and to make it clear. But it's not necessarily the whole story. For example, we teach that if there's pollution from producing a particular commodity, then if you want to, and that's a negative side effect, and you won't get an efficient outcome in the presence of an externality like pollution. So therefore, in this simple textbook analysis, we should impose a tax on that activity, and that will raise the cost. That will mean that less is produced and consumed in equilibrium, and that can be beneficial. But what's kind of left unsaid in many of the introductory economics or intermediate economics analyses is, well, how big is the tax? If the tax is pretty small, it can't be doing too much harm, but it also can't be doing that much good. It may not be sufficient to actually internalize the externality. Okay, it needs to be big enough to offset the extra harm that's caused by this particular activity. But if you make the tax really large, okay, you may drive this market to being much smaller than the socially efficient level, even the efficient level that accounts for the externality. And so it's not so trivial to know what the correct level is of these, what economists call Pigouvian taxes, externality addressing taxes. And so that's just one example of how I think when you try to do these policies, these interventions in practice, it's at a minimum harder and messier and more likely to make a mistake than the standard introductory analysis indicates.
Now we know that in these days, like American economics has changed a lot. Like Trump has started like new regulations, and he, as we see in media, we don't really know that much about American economics, like the people from any other countries. But what we see in media is that he is putting a lot of taxes and tariffs on other countries. What do you think about its effects?
So there's standard analysis that's pretty widely agreed upon about what the effects of those tariffs are likely to be. And setting aside a few special cases, those effects are almost always undesirable and are in no way, shape, or form guaranteed to have the effects that tariff advocates think of as benefits, although I don't think economists would necessarily agree that those are obviously benefits. Most specifically, many advocates of tariffs, including President Trump, want to promote U.S. domestic manufacturing activity. Okay, it's not clear why we should care about what portion of our economic activity is manufacturing versus services versus anything else. Okay, that should really depend on whether we're relatively productive at doing manufacturing things compared to other countries. Maybe the US has got to the point where it's much better. It has a comparative advantage in supplying goods which are more high tech, which are more abstract, which are less about standard manufacturing of computers or cars or whatever. But regardless, okay, tariffs are a very, very crude and often counterproductive instrument for trying to promote manufacturing because the tariffs raise many of the costs of engaging in manufacturing for U.S. domestic producers. And so while they might cause some substitution, say for people to buy domestic cars versus foreign cars, they also raise the cost of producing cars domestically and other intermediate goods domestically. And that might to undo any gains you get by causing this substitution. And the evidence is sort of consistent with that. There's very little evidence that these tariffs have actually improved manufacturing output, increased manufacturing output in the US. And at the same time, they've caused prices to be higher and various other unintended negatives. So there are special cases where you can maybe make an arguable case for certain kinds of tariffs. The broad brush sort of things that we've been doing in the last year and a half don't even remotely come close to that.
It's a wonderful answer. So in our previous episode, we had like Professor Richard Bensel joined us, and we asked him a question about like the differences and similarities of American, Russian, and Chinese politics. What we ask right now from you is about economics. What are some differences and similarities in these three countries?
Well, in broad brush, you could say there's, in my view, far too many similarities. There's too much government intervening as to what goods should be produced, where they should be produced, what prices should be in various markets. There's way too much interference with free market forces. Okay, obviously happens in Russia to a very significant degree, in China to a huge degree, and more and more and more over time, and accelerating during the Trump administrations in the US. That said, quantitatively, the US is certainly so far doing much less to interfere with free markets than those other two countries. We still are an extremely productive economy. We've been growing consistently for a long, long time, setting aside things like the COVID recession. But overall, the growth path has been really good. And as best I can tell, the Trump administration has been beneficial in some respects in terms of fostering free markets. The rate at which new regulation is being put into place in various aspects of the economy has been slower than it was under previous administrations, previous Democrat or Republican administrations. So that's good. That helps offset some of the negative things. The negative things that are happening in the U.S. is there's a newfound right-wing populist enthusiasm for antitrust enforcement. There's a populist right-wing enthusiasm for regulating social media and AI and things like that. And there's also seems to be a burst, again, not entirely new by any stretch, but a substantial increase in crony capitalism, the federal government taking stakes in all sorts of private companies or cutting deals with private companies that they get some lucrative deal in exchange for some sort of payoff contribution or ownership stake to the federal government or members of Trump's friends, families, donor crowd, whatever. And that's going in exactly the wrong direction. And that's the kind of thing that people appropriately criticize about what happens in Russia and China.
So, talking about AI, you said
Right.
that we asked that like in every episode, what are the effects of AI in politics or economy? We are asking it from you. We got different answers. Like in last episode, we talked about American politics with Richard Bensel, and he said that there is a little or even not change, even no changes in like American politics with the introduction of AI. What do you think about American economics or even global economics?
So I think both extremes that you hear about AI and its implications for economic activity, productivity, et cetera, both extremes seem extremely unlikely to me. And I think we're seeing a gradual buildup of evidence that reinforces my view. Okay. People who think that it's going to have some catastrophic implications, that employment for everyone except a few billionaires will go to zero, massive unemployment and all. There's no evidence of that, just as there's been no evidence of that when other new technologies have come along. Okay? Will there be effects on people in some industries, in some skill groups, in some occupations? Almost certainly. Doing certain types of coding using AI seems to be far more effective than writing all your code from scratch or from other sources. And so the degree to which you can earn a good living as a kind of just run-of-the-mill average software person who writes basic code to do very basic things, maybe that will tend to go away because AI will be able to do it effectively. But there will be all sorts of new things that will come along because AI exists, okay, that will create more opportunities for employment for various groups of people. Okay. I think the people who think that AI is going to be so fantastically successful are also exaggerating. It has its own downsides, its own cost, its own difficulties. So it's a new technology. I don't think government should do anything to impede its adoption. They shouldn't be doing anything to try to deliberately spur its adoption, other than government using it itself in cases where it seems to make sense. Um, so to me, it's more boring than anything else. It's certainly relevant and useful for some people in some activities and some occupations, but it's not this revolutionary thing that many people are making it out to be in either direction.
Well, to as I understand that before COVID, the economics and politics were different. What do you think about the change after the COVID in economics and politics?
To me, the main thing about lasting impact of COVID was that what libertarians tended to think of as overreaction in some dimensions, I think has sort of hit a nerve that was already there. It exacerbated a pre-existing sort of concern and has led to excessive reaction in certain dimensions. So basically, I'm thinking of things like the vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy has existed for centuries. You know, when the very first vaccines came out, 200 or 300 years ago, there was concerns about it. Obviously, more understandable then, since we didn't have as much science and as much experience, et cetera. But there are plenty of vaccine hesitance all along, long before COVID came along. But this suspicion or frustration that many people have with being told, this is what you should eat, this is what medicines you should take, this is the way you should worry about your health, and having it in some cases imposed by government, okay, that was very likely going to annoy some people and generate a potential for a backlash. And then COVID really fed into that. So we now have this extreme forms of that with people like RFK Jr. wanting to, change the entire way that government analyzes data, provides data, makes recommendations, et cetera. And I find the whole debate very frustrating because, on the one hand, I think some of the things that the RFK crowd are saying are Looney Tunes. The evidence on whether vaccines are safe, almost entirely, whether they're effective, it's very, very sort of clear in the vast majority of cases. So the doubts he's raising, okay, the claims he's making that vaccines cause autism and all that, they're just utter nonsense. At the same time, I'm not sympathetic to the, say, public health view that we should necessarily be telling people exactly what to do and requiring them to do it. Okay. Basically, I don't think the government should really be doing much at all on those sorts of questions. Public health groups, private public health groups, doctors, American Medical Association, or high school health and education, health teacher, all, friends, family, they can all provide information and suggestion that it might be a good idea to get certain vaccines, but there would be no coercion. And I think there would probably be more voluntary compliance, voluntary take up if there were no coercion and if we hadn't had the whole COVID episode. So it's going to take a long time before we get away from the backlash caused by pushing too hard on COVID about vaccines, COVID about masks, COVID about lockdowns, closing school, keeping schools closed and all those sorts of things. Um, so that's my hunch.
About European countries after COVID?
What do I think about European countries after COVID? I don't have as much information, so I guess I mainly can't answer that question. The one thing I would point people to in looking at Europe is Sweden. Sweden did not have lockdowns, did not have nearly as many of these very aggressive policies as most of Europe, US, other parts of the world did. And yet, Sweden's experience in terms of excess mortality during the COVID period, et cetera, okay, was, if anything, better than the sort of countries in the kind of middle of the pack in Europe. So it's one data point, okay, maybe it's due to some random other factors, but it by itself provided zero evidence that the extreme measures were necessary or productive.
Our last question is the question that we ask every single episode. So the question is, if you had a chance to give us one powerful political or even like economical insight or advice that you learned through your years of experience and research, what would it be? In our recent episode, Richard Bensel shared a powerful insight from Karl Popper. What do you say?
The thing that I feel has been illustrated most convincingly or most dramatically by the last year and a half, and before, is that if you give the government power, if you put the government in a position of erecting monuments, of funding museums, running the Kennedy Center, of designing healthcare systems, of running energy policy, et cetera. Okay. In many cases, reasonable people make perfectly plausible sounding arguments that these powers you've given to the government, that Congress has given the government, or that the presidents have taken for themselves, that they can be used for good. And of course, that's often true. Okay, not universally by any stretch, but often true. But once those powers are in the hand of the government, they can also be used for things that are not obviously so good. And of course, different people will disagree about what's good or bad. But let's take the example of the Kennedy Center, okay, which was partially government funded and supervised and operated. People on the left are right now horrified that Trump tried to take over the Kennedy Center, put his name on it, change the programming, et cetera. Okay? But before Trump did this, people who were more of a liberal persuasion were choosing which artists, choosing what kind of programming, choosing what themes. And that was going to undoubtedly annoy some people who didn't happen to share those particular political views. The key question is, why does the government need to be involved at all? There is no reasonably defensible market failure or any story about why, if people want to watch opera or hear country and western singers or whatever the programming was at the Kennedy Center, they can't purchase it privately without the government being involved. And then there's never going to be any controversy over whether the government should take a stand. Same thing with museums. If people want to go to museums, they're free to do so. If people want to start museums, they're free to do so. But if the government funds a museum, it's going to appear to many people that it's taking a particular position. It's using taxpayer dollars to tilt the playing field with one interpretation versus another of history. And the next president might have a different view and try to tilt it in that different direction. That's always going to be contentious. It's going to generate controversy and polarization. And there's absolutely no need for it. So unless there's a really compelling reason the government needs to be involved in a particular activity, it should stay out, in part because one huge unintended consequence is that power is going to be used for evil sooner or later, even if it was initially designed for a purpose that you happen to think was a good purpose.
Very good advice and insight. So before ending, I would like to ask a personal question. It's not like part of the podcast. What are your current research topics and what are you doing right now? Can you share about this?
I don't have any particular research that I would describe. I've mainly been working on my Substack and Cato related activities recently. And
Uh,
so my Substack goes all over the place for any policy question where I think the libertarian perspective could be useful.
okay, thanks. Thanks for you for joining today uh, to us. It was a really good masterclass. Thank you again. And even it was brief, I learned a lot about today's economics. I thought that I know a lot about economics, but you proved me wrong. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.